Good evening. Welcome to my session this evening, which is all about the novel. What is a novel? This is a question that me and Susan Elderkin asked ourselves frequently when we were writing The Novel Cure back in 2013. But I recently was asking myself that question again because I was sent this book by the School of Life. It's called A Voice of One's Own by the School of Life. Is it a novel? That is what I am asking myself and all of you. And we will come back to this shortly. I don't think it is a novel, but I'd love to know what you all think. I'm going to start off by giving you a few definitions of the novel, and I'd love to know any of your thoughts about what you think a novel is, or even what you think maybe it should be. So, there is a dictionary definition of the novel, which is a novel is a fictitious prose narrative of book length, typically representing a character and action with some degree of realism. That sounds quite off-putting, doesn't it? Fictitious prose narrative of book length. There's another definition I've got: an invented prose narrative that's usually long and complex and deals especially with human experience through a usually connected sequence of events. Well, we all know that novels, particularly nowadays, are not always necessarily connected events, and they're not necessarily long either. They might be quite short. It happens quite handily that I've also written about what a novel is in this book, which I'd actually forgotten until earlier this evening. So it's a bit stained, which is a bit upsetting, but it is a very nice book with lots of lovely pictures in it. Kind of a coffee table book about literature, which I wrote and edited. There's quite a few other people that contributed to the book who are all glorious writers. And I did write about the novel because that's what I love. And when I studied English literature at Cambridge, the novel was my speciality. So I've always felt like I know lots about novels, but I also know that one's ideas about novels are ever changing, particularly listening to the great programme that Damien Barr recently made on Radio 4. It's on BBC Sounds now, which is called, just going to tell you that, uh, True Lies, Memoir and Me. Whose truth is it anyway? Fiction, True Lies, Damned Lies, and Auto Fiction. So Damien Barr done a brilliant program all about what novels are and autofiction versus memoir versus fiction, in which he delves deep into what novels are. And I'd very strongly recommend that you listen to that. There's 4 episodes, it's on BBC Sounds, and it's great. Lovely to see lots of people joining tonight. Great to see you, Antoine, Laurent, and viewing all sorts. Great to see you too, and lovely to see people joining on Facebook as well. So, quite handily, I have written a definition of the novel in this. We've got lots of different types of novels, including the Bildungsroman, Bodice Ripper, Flintlock, folklore, grimdark, novella, mytho fantasy. Oh, these are all terms that relate to the novel. Then I've got a bit about the birth of the novel, and I'll just read you a little bit about it because it is quite a helpful explanation of what a novel is before we go into particular novels and before we decide whether this is a novel or not. Written by the School of Life. Can a corporation write a novel? That's what I'm asking. Um, the birth of the novel. Long fictional narratives describing human experiences on an intimate psychological basis. The first works, now regarded as novels, emerged in Japan with Murasaki Shikibu's Tale of Genji, which was written in 1010, and China with novels such as Shi Naian's Water Margin, 14th century. The progenitors of the European novel included epic verse narratives such as Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, 14th century, and spiritual autobiographies such as that of Saint Teresa of Avila, 1565, with their intense focus on the inner life of the narrator. Verse epics gradually gave way to prose as authors saw the benefits of combining popular stories with previously written in verse with serious histories composed in prose. The historical elements bringing an educational quality to what would otherwise be a mere entertainment. Because of their length, novels were the first form of literature that allowed space for in-depth character development rather than simply being a record of their deeds. The English word novel derives from the Italian novello, meaning a short story about something new. At first, there was some debate as to whether novels were the same as romances. Cervantes' Don Quixote, 1615, frequently cited as the first modern novel, was shaped by that debate. So there you go, that's the birth of the novel as described by me in this handy textbook all about literature. There's also then a page on the epistolary novel, novel written in letter form, historical novel, science fiction, crime. Then there's a section on Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of the greatest novelists, horror, utopia slash dystopia, fantasy, romance, and what else have we got? Graphic novel, young adult, controversial as to whether that should be a separate category or not, LGBTQI+, and then that's the end of that section. So there you go. All your answers can be found in this rather marvellous book. And for examples of great novels to read, look no further than The Novel Cure, although, of course, that was published in 2013. So there's been a lot of amazing novels written since then. Definitely time to update that Novel Cure in the near future. So moving on to what is a novel, I've got quite a great selection of books that I would love to share with you. So before we start, we go back again to this question of whether this is a novel, which is what started the whole idea. So the Divine Comedy by Dante is a kind of verse epic, and that's how, as I was saying earlier, novels began. They were frequently written in verse, and Dante's Divine Comedy gave birth to other epic poems. The Decameron of Boccaccio actually came before Dante's Divine Comedy, which is another epic verse poem where many of the great stories that are later to be found in the Canterbury Tales, for instance, are described. I just want to mention while we're here, Pearl, which is written by the Pearl poet, who also wrote Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of my favourite ever verse epic poems. Pearl is a really beautiful verse poem that could be described as a novel, which is all about the loss of a daughter to a couple and how she, Pearl, crosses over the river into the land of death or heaven. And this particularly came to mind because one of the Booker contenders is a novel called Pearl, which I was really hoping was going to have a lot of descriptions of this poem, but it didn't. So I was a bit disappointed, to be perfectly honest, although it is a gorgeous novel. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, so I was just a little bit disappointed. So those are ancient verse narratives written in the 14th century or earlier. And similarly, Malory wrote The Mort d'Arthur, which I think was written in the 13th century, which is another massive epic verse poem which we studied in Cambridge back in the day, which is tales of knights and um, romance and King Arthur and his knights. And it is actually a fantastic read. Most people don't tend to read it now because it is written in very ancient language. I'll just give you a little random taste of it. "This is an harder case," said Sir Lancelot, "that other I must die, other to choose one of you. Yet had I lever die in this prison with worship than to have one of you to my paramour, maigre mine heed. And therefore ye be answered, I will none of you, for ye be false enchanters. And as for my lady, Dame Guinevere, were I at my liberty as I was, I would prove it on yours that she is the truest lady unto his lord living." It's actually not that hard, really. You just have to um, go along with the slightly strange spellings, but if you read it aloud, you totally get it. It's a great read, and that's one of the earliest novels. So novels, they are fiction, though not always. They can also be a mixture of truth and fiction, such as In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. That is one of the books that everyone always cites as a kind of novel, a new type of novel that's faction because it was based on the true case of a man that murdered an entire family. And Truman Capote completely got into the heads of the people that perpetrated the murder and wrote the story like a novel, but it was actually based on truth. Another book that comes to mind that one wonders if it's a novel or not is Carlos Castaneda's The Teaching of Don Juan. So Carlos Castaneda wrote 7 books in this series, which are all about his delvings into the Mexican spiritual way of life, whereby he would take mezcal and go into a psychedelic state and have amazing experiences. And the joyous and wonderful thing about these books is that they are written as if they are the truth, but they might well be fiction. And many people assume that they are indeed fiction because Carlos Castaneda has all these incredible experiences whereby he flies through the air, he manages to shrink himself down to the size of a flea, he takes on the spiritual identity of other animals or birds or other beings, and he has all these absolutely fantastically crazy and psychedelic experiences, but they are in the way that he writes, they are completely presented as if they are the truth, and lots of people believe that they are true, but then many also say it's entirely fictional and he made the whole thing up. So is this a novel or is it truth? That is the question. And it's a very fine line between the two, which is why, as I was saying earlier, you should definitely listen to Damien Barr's excellent series on BBC Sounds, which is all about what is fact, what is fiction. It's called Whose Truth Is It Anyway? Fiction, True Lies, Damned Lies, and Auto Fiction. So do check that out because it really does go into great depth about what is a novel as well and what makes fiction fiction, what makes auto fiction a different genre, and what's the difference between memoir and fiction. So many questions and so many exciting books to mention. So I wanted also to mention Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was written in AD 46. And could this be described as a novel, I wonder? It's slightly trickier because it's many different stories that have been interwoven, but it is written in a kind of logical timeline because Ovid starts with the beginning of the world as with the creation according to ancient Roman myths, which is what he was using to create his kind of Bible of his telling of how the world began and what the key stories from the beginning of time are, according to the mythology of Roman times. So he starts with the creation. I'll just read you a little bit. Before the earth and the sea and the all-encompassing heaven came into being, the whole of nature displayed but a single face, which men have called chaos, a crude, unstructured mass. Nothing but weight without motion, a general conglomeration of matter, composed of disparate, incompatible elements. No Titan, the sun god, was present to cast his rays on the universe, nor Phoebe the moon to replenish her horns and grow to her fullness. No earth suspended in equilibrium, wrapped in its folding mantle of air, nor Aphrodite, the goddess of ocean, to stretch her sinuous arms all round the earth's long coastline. Although the land and the sea and the sky were involved in the great mass, no one could stand on the land or swim in the waves of the sea, and the sky had no light. None of the elements kept its shape, and all were in conflict inside one body, the cold with the hot, the wet with the dry, the soft with the hard, and weight with the weightless. Chaos, in other words. So Ovid starts with the beginning of the world, but he then romps through all sorts of fantastic stories, which are all many stories that you will be familiar with from your knowledge of Greek myths. But he has stories of the Minotaur, for instance, Scylla and Charybdis, um, Peleus and Thetis, Icarus, the Battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs, all sorts of amazing stories, many of which you'll be familiar with, but some you won't. And they are written in a kind of verse poem. Is it a novel? I think that it is. And this also makes me think of another book, which not everyone would call a novel, Cosmic Comics by Italo Calvino, which is actually has quite a lot in common with Metamorphoses, because this is kind of mythological type short stories which are all loosely connected. And I think it is actually great to read it all in one go, like a novel, even though they are short stories all about different things, but they do all connect. So, for instance, we got The Distance of the Moon, which is all about how the moon used to be really close to the earth and people could go up a ladder to get to the moon and collect cheese and bring it back down to eat. Then there's At Daybreak, A Sign in Space, All at One Point, Without Colours, Games Without End, The Aquatic Uncle, How Much Shall We Bet, The Form of Space, The Light Years and The Spiral. All of these books, all of these stories are stories relating to the beginning of time. For instance, All at One Point is about how it's kind of about the Big Bang. It's about how every little being in the entire universe was all connected at one point, as with the beginning of the Big Bang. And it's a completely crazy story and fantastic, like all of Calvino's stories. They are translated from the Italian, I just have to point out, but they're absolutely fantastic reads. And my favourite one is The Distance of the Moon, which I'd very much recommend as a must read. But they're all really great to read, and they do read like a novel because lots of the characters within each story flow on into the next story. So, for instance, there's a character called Quifqua, something like QFWFQK, who is a being who starts off as an atom, but then he comes back in another story as a horse, and then he comes back as another story as a aquatic uncle, who is a fishy creature that comes out of the sea, evolving to become something that walks on the land. So all these stories are about evolution. They're it definitely in the same vein as Ovid's Metamorphoses, because they describe to us the beginning of the world. And that's why we love novels, I think, because we find truth in fiction. That is, I feel, why novelists write novels, because they want to find truth in a story. And that's why we read novels as well, because we find the truth that is in fiction. One of the other early novels from back in the day is Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, which some call the first novel in the English language, which describes the life and times and opinions of Tristram Shandy. And it starts off from his birth and goes through his entire life in enormous detail, with a lot of digressions on the way. And Lawrence Sterne was famously one of the first people to talk to the reader when he was writing his novel. He put in lists. He had all sorts of kind of little jokey things that he did with the reader, talking to you, putting in these little breakups of the text. There's a page, I'm just trying to find it, which is completely black in the novel. There's also a really lovely page that has a kind of, oh look, there's a white blank page where he's giving you a little opportunity to write your own bit in the novel. And there's also a lovely bit where he's done a sort of swirl of a walking stick going through the air, which I can't find to show you. But I love the way he plays with visuals in a very groovily graphic way. He's not just writing a straight text, he likes to break it up. And you are completely inside the head of Tristram Shandy, which is why we fall in love with the man and the book, a bit like you do when you read a more modern book by Barbara Kingsolver, Demon Copperhead, which is a book that is completely in the head of the main protagonist, Demon Copperhead. And Barbara Kingsolver based this book on David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, which is also a really lovely novel all about a man growing up and starting with very difficult and dire beginnings, but then he does manage to pull himself up out of the mire. So Charles Dickens' novel, David Copperfield, was a very autobiographical kind of novel, and everyone says it's his most autobiographical novel. And it describes how David Copperfield came from an impoverished background, deep poverty, and a sense of hopelessness. His mother died when he was very young, but he does eventually manage to pull himself up out of the very difficult background that he came from. And similarly, Demon Copperhead in Barbara Kingsolver's fantastic Pulitzer Prize winning novel describes how Demon Copperhead is born into an incredibly poor family. His mother dies when he's really young. She's an addict and she dies of an overdose of oxytocin. And Demon Copperhead himself then also becomes addicted to oxytocin because he has a knee injury. And he seems to be destined for a completely hopeless existence. But he does miraculously manage to pull himself out of misery, partly because he has a talent for drawing and he manages to get into the world of comics and graphic novels, just like David Copperfield in Dickens' novel manages to eventually become an author, hence the autobiographical vibe. So these are both fantastic novels describing the life of one man and sucking you in brilliantly because they are so completely detailed and you entirely believe in the person to the extent that you don't really want to leave them at the end of the book. And that is also why we love novels, because the characters become utterly believable in the novel when you're reading it, because you spend so much time with them. So going back to Tristram Shandy, which I was talking about just now, which was one of the books that starts to really play with the way that the author talks to the reader by asking questions of the reader as he goes along, giving lists, doing playful things with text, and occasionally leaving blank pages where you can put in your own ideas into the book. Another novel which has something in common with Tristram Shandy is Life a User's Manual by Georges Perec. Just seen that Artichaut Tim has joined from France, or maybe you're not in France, Tim, but you will clearly recognize Georges Perec as a fantastic French novelist. Antoine, if you're still here, I wonder what you think of Perec. Do you love him, or do you find him a difficult kind of writer? So Georges Perec, a little bit like Lawrence Stern, I think, loves to play with the reader by putting in interesting aspects of text, putting in lists, poems, um, indexes, and this whole book is written as if it is a series of chess moves by the knight on the chessboard, going from one chapter to the other. But he always goes two spaces forward, one to the side when he's writing each chapter. The whole book is about an apartment in Paris, and it's about all the different people that live in the apartment on each floor and how they interact with each other. And the entire book is set within the apartment, though journeys are made from it, which are also described. It's about a man who makes puzzles for a living, and he creates the puzzles. He goes out into the world and paints a picture. Then he has a proper puzzle maker cut it up for him. Then he puts it back together, glues it together, then floats the finished picture off the backing that it's been put on, and keeps the painting that was painted separate to the puzzle bits. And it's a completely mad exercise, which some would call completely pointless, which the hero of this book devotes his entire life to. And you could call it an exercise in pointlessness, or you could call it an antidote to pointlessness, because it's a kind of venture into mindfulness and into living in the moment and into doing something with your whole life that seems completely pointless, but which is an absolute celebration of life itself. And I do feel that this is an absolutely fantastic novel of a very different kind to many of the other ones that we're describing tonight. But it also is a great one that has a lot in common with Tristram Shandy, one of the first novels ever written in the English language. Um, Now, I wanted to talk about going back to Italo Calvino again, another novel which is a bit in the vein of cosmic comics and if and of its metamorphosis. This is a book in which lots of different stories are started and not finished, which is incredibly frustrating. So it does kind of read like a whole series of disconnected short stories, but the short stories do ultimately connect, as you can tell by the titles of each short story, which I'm now going to read you. If on a winter's night a traveller, outside the town of Malbork, leaning from the steep slope without fear of wind or vertigo, looks down at the gathering shadow in a network of lines that enlace, in a network of lines that intersect, on the carpet of leaves illuminated by the moon, around an empty grave. what story down there awaits its end? Well, the story is enigmatic, let's be honest, and that is definitely true of the entire book. But this is one of my favourite novels because Calvino completely seduces you into his version of truth, which is all about the joy of reading and the joy of books. This is a book to read if you love books and if you love reading, because Calvino describes the total seductiveness of getting stuck into a good story, which is, after all, what we're looking for in a novel, isn't it? We want to be lost in the story. We want to escape. We want to travel into other times and other places. We want to travel back into our own past, which we can do by reading novels that we read when we were children. If you pick up a book that you read as a child, then it instantly gives you a kind of time travel effect, taking you back into that time that you first read the book. Uh, and we also want to share the stories. So in this book, there's lots of people that are massive book enthusiasts, story enthusiasts, and they pass those stories on to each other. They pass the books on to each other. And that's what we readers love to do with novels as well. We love to share them with our friends, with our lovers, with our colleagues, and that's one of the great joys of novels, is the fact that we can share them. And if you know that another person that you've just met, for instance, has read the same book that you've just read, whether it's Demon Copperhead or Fahrenheit 451, that's going to instantly give you a fantastic link and ability to understand each other. You know that if you've both read this book, that you have a certain understanding of the world, which only you and other readers of that book are going to fully connect with. So anyone that loves to read novels should definitely read this fantastic novel, which might seem like lots of short stories that don't quite connect up. But once you finish the whole book, it makes a kind of sense, even though it still has quite a lot of enigmas in it. I'm just going to check if there's a cat trying to get into my room, which is always quite scary when it happens. Yes, there is. The cats, the cats can open the doors, and Cappuccino the cat just did, and it always gives me a bit of a shiver down my spine because you just hear them pawing, clawing at the door. It's kind of terrifying. So I do have more books to discuss, and I will come to them, but I'm just going to talk for a minute about this one, which is the book that got me going down the route of what is a novel. So there was a newsletter from the School of Life that said, "We have written a novel," which made me think, oh, we have written a novel. That sounds a bit corporate. And the way that the email was expressed made me think it was a bit like a kind of AI type of creation. Um, I have worked for the School of Life for many years and I am a big fan of theirs. But when I saw this, I did think that sounds a bit weird. I then read the back of the book when I got hold of a copy, which says there were clues in the past too as to Anna's restlessness. She had always felt that what she had done was not enough. She had never secured herself the right school grades. At the office, she had never won her company enough business. And in the broader scheme of her life, she could not relax and enjoy a holiday or period of respite. But this sense of not being enough was not written in stone. It had a history that could be unpicked. So that immediately gave me rather big alarm bells because I thought that totally sounds like a kind of self-help vibe, which is trying to get you to read the novel because Anna is restless. She's never felt like she's done enough in her life. She hadn't secured herself the right school grades. She hadn't won her company enough business. She's feeling inadequate. Uh, and you immediately get the feeling from this book, A Voice of One's Own, that there's going to be a kind of self-help message, and verily there is. So the other thing about the book that I was not immediately loving is that it's got these photos running through it, which I'm not averse to. It's kind of fun to have a book, a novel that is illustrated, and they are beautifully taken photos, but it's the whole way it's laid out that just feels unbearably self-helpy. Even the fact that it has a conclusion and an afterword, it's just clearly a self-help book, frankly. And it's not even written by one person, it's written by a corporation. My husband expressed, I think, rather brilliantly what makes this not a novel. He said, the closer a publication gets to looking like a PowerPoint presentation, the further away it is from being a novel. And this really does look like a PowerPoint presentation with its photos and its little explanations underneath. So the book is about Anna, who is in a job that she doesn't like. She has a relationship that goes wrong. Her parents, she feels quite distant from her parents. I'm not going to go into it all. It's pretty boring, really, as you can see. I would contest that it's not a novel, and that it's quite weird that the School of Life have decided to put it out there as a novel when, look, it's a story about confidence and self-belief. I feel it's quite peculiar and not what I'm looking for in a novel. And it's kind of like an anti-novel, really, in the way that it is a very long way away from what we really want from a novel. What we want from a novel is to have characters that we believe in, to delve into their psyche, for them to be quirky and strange and odd and human and believably different. And we want to completely, fully enter into their lives and believe in them as real people, like we do with uh, Demon Copperhead, for instance. I mean, here is a person that has terrible low self-esteem because um, he grows up with no proper parent figures. He goes from one home to another, and he um, the only talent that he has, he loses because he gets an injury. But it's a fantastic book because we completely believe in Demon Copperhead. We love him. We know that he's a real character, but even though he is completely fictional. Whereas this, we completely don't believe in the person. There's no quirks, there's no vulnerability, and it's just not even fiction, frankly. Highly disappointing. So, all in all, I'm going to have to conclude that this is actually not a novel. And that's what got me started down this route this evening. Um, but before I stop, I will just talk about a couple of brilliant novels that I love and how they're different to other types of novels. So, Hotel World by Ali Smith is another kind of novel which has 5 different voices giving versions of the same event, which is the death of a girl in a hotel who fell down a shaft where there was a um, pulley system. What do you call it when you have a bell? A dumbwaiter. A dumbwaiter. That's how she died. And this is a brilliantly experimental novel where there are 5 different voices telling the same event. And the first one starts off with the girl herself falling down the shaft, and she is literally screaming as she falls down the shaft, going, woo, woo, what a fall, what a soar, what a plummet, what a dash into dark, into light, what a plunge, what a glide, thud, crash, what a drop, what a rush, what a swoop, what a fright, what a mad hush skirl, what a smash, mush, mash up, broken, gashed, what a heart in my mouth, what an end, what a life, what a time, what I felt, then, gone. Great start to a novel, and great to read aloud as well. So that's Ali Smith, fantastic novel, and a different kind to others that we've been describing. Another different type of novel, which has its own inner logic, is Blindness by Jose Saramago, which is a novel that I very much love, one of my favourites, and one that I recommend to people very frequently. It's about a husband and wife who endure a terrible dystopian nightmare without going into what happens in too much detail because I don't want to give it away. It's about a plague of blindness, and during that plague of blindness, the authorities react to the plague by trying to lock everyone up and contain the blindness so that not everyone in the whole country gets it. It's in an unnamed South American country, and it's grim, but it's also a love story because it's about the husband and wife and how they stick together through the horror. And it's all told in a stream of consciousness style. It's translated from the Portuguese. It's not the easiest read because of the fact that it is reasonably unbroken. It does have paragraphs, but there's very long passages and long pages with very little punctuation. And actually, I have occasionally given it to people who've said, I think there's something wrong with my book, it's got no punctuation. But it is meant to be like that. So, this is another kind of novel which is fantastic, but a different type of format to many of the novels that we've previously discussed. And one other, just to talk about novels in different formats, is John McGregor's beautiful book, If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, which is, I was going to say, written in a very poetic form, but actually now I'm opening it, quite a lot of it is written in more traditional paragraphs, but then also quite a lot of it is written kind of in verse form. And this is a really lovely book about uh, a street in which everyone in the street is described exactly what's happening to them at any one moment of one day. I'm pretty sure it all takes place over kind of 24 hours. And there is a very dramatic incident that happens within the book, which I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to give you spoilers. And it seems terrible and tragic and awful, and it is. But there's also a really lovely redemptive moment and side to it. So that is a lovely book. It's about life and death. It's kind of, in a way, a very tiny viewpoint of life. But that's one of the things that I love about the novel as a genre, that you can have an entire book written about one absolutely tiny thing, just one street in this instance, and all the people that live in that street. Very similar in a way to Life a User's Manual, which is all about one apartment block in Paris. And we still have an amazing richness and sense of the entire world evoked through just reading about this one street. So that is a fantastic novel in poetic form. Um, so novels that I haven't yet mentioned, I just wanted to bring in this one, Requiem for a Dream by Hubert Selby Jr., because this is a novel that had a massive effect on me when I read it, probably in my late 20s, because it is a really impressively awful description of what happens when you become a junkie, having started off thinking that you were just going into business as a heroin dealer. And it's incredibly sad about these teenagers who um, decide that they're going to acquire their dream of having a cafe in the middle of the countryside where they can live and work and have a kind of beautiful, dreamy existence. They're going to get there by selling heroin and thus making enough money to start off their dream. But of course, it all goes horribly wrong. And this has been made into a brilliant film, which I would also thoroughly recommend, which was directed by Darren Aronofsky. Uh, the novel itself is even more devastating, perhaps, than the film. It's quite a hard read, but it is a book that makes you want to seize the day because it's showing you how badly things can go wrong if you don't seize the day. So that was just to say that novels can obviously have an incredibly strong effect on you, and that's why I love to prescribe novels to people, and that's why my job is to be a bibliotherapist, and that's why I spend much of my time thinking about new novels, old novels, classic novels, novels that are different, novels written in challenging and unusual ways, novels written in easy and light and entertaining ways, just like Jilly Cooper that I'm reading at the moment, which is a very easy read and very good fun, which is, you could say, the total opposite of a book like Requiem for a Dream. So I am a lover of all kinds of novels. I'd love to know, what are your favourite novels? Do you have a genre of novel that you love the best? Are there any novels that you really hate? Or are there any books that you've read that you've thought, this is a novel, and it's turned out maybe not to be a novel? Um, like that, you might say. So do send me your thoughts. I'd love to know. And also, if you have any other bibliotherapy questions, send them in to me and I will attempt to address them on here over the next few weeks. I'm going to try and come back to doing them every Wednesday night. And do also bear in mind that you can book a bibliotherapy session with me one to one, or book one for a friend. They make a fantastic gift, great for Christmas gifts. Go to my website, find my email address, and you can book a session with me there. Uh, if you do book it, you get sent a lovely voucher by email and a questionnaire which asks you all about your literary loves and hates. And we then have our session, which lasts for an hour. And after that, I send a prescription of 6 books with the reasons that I'm prescribing those books. So it's a prescription, it doesn't include the actual books, it's just the recommendations for the books. So bear that in mind. Bibliotherapy session, a great Christmas gift. Christmas is coming. And if you do have any other bibliotherapy questions, questions that you think might be treated with a book, any ailments, let me know and I would love to help and give you some recommendations. And on that merry note, I will leave you for this week. Thanks for joining me and see you next week. Good night.